At 2:17 a.m. on the 6th of June 1944, Private First Class John Steele crouched in the wreckage of his Waco CG-4A glider 400 yards behind German lines in Normandy, watching 12 Wehrmacht soldiers form a search perimeter around his position. 22 years old, Indiana farm boy, zero combat experience. His glider had crashed 3 minutes earlier. The pilot was dead. His co-pilot had a compound fracture in both legs. The 8 other infantrymen who'd survived the landing were scattered across a hedgerow field, separated, disoriented, alone. Steele had one advantage the Germans didn't know about yet. He was still mobile, and he had exactly one piece of equipment that hadn't been lost in the crash. A standard issue mess kit spoon in his right boot. The Germans were 80 yards out, moving inward in a tightening circle. They had flashlights, rifles, discipline. They were hunting methodically. In the previous 90 minutes, German units in this sector had captured or killed 37 American paratroopers and glider infantry. The Wehrmacht knew the invasion was happening. They knew isolated American soldiers were scattered across the countryside. They knew how to find them. Steele pressed himself against the glider's broken fuselage. The CG-4A had come apart on impact. The nose section had sheared off completely. The wings had folded. What remained was 20 feet of aluminum frame and canvas fabric, not enough cover to hide him for more than 2 minutes once the Germans reached his position. His M1 Garand was gone, lost somewhere in the crash. His helmet was gone. His field pack was gone. He had his uniform, his boots, and a mess kit spoon he'd shoved in his boot that morning at the airfield in England because the mess sergeant had been short on utensils and told everyone to bring their own. The spoon was aluminum, 7 inches long, standard U.S. Army issue, manufactured by thousands in quartermaster depots across America. Nothing special about it, except that it was the only tool Steele had left. The German voices grew louder 60 yards. They were calling to each other, coordinating their sweep. Professional soldiers, experienced, efficient. Steele had been in the Army for 11 months. He'd completed basic training at Fort Benning, glider infantry school at Camp Mockle, invasion rehearsals in southern England. He'd never fired a shot in combat, never been hunted by men who wanted him dead. Standard doctrine for isolated soldiers was clear. Evade and escape, move away from enemy forces, find friendly units, regroup. But Steele couldn't move. The hedgerow field was open terrain. The moon was bright enough to cast shadows. If he ran, they'd see him. If he stayed, they'd find him. He looked at the ground, beneath the glider wreckage, Norman soil. Soft, recently plowed. The field had been farmland before the war. Probably still was. French farmers had been growing crops here for centuries. Steele had an idea. It violated every piece of tactical training he'd received. It was desperate, impossible, insane. But he was out of options. He pulled the spoon from his boot. If you want to see how Steele used that spoon to escape 12 German soldiers, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the war. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Steele. The German search line was 40 yards out. Steele could see their silhouettes moving through the darkness. He dropped to his stomach and began digging. The spoon cut into the soft Norman soil. 1 scoop, 2 scoops, 3. The ground was loose, easy to work. Recent rain had softened it. He dug faster. The spoon made almost no noise. Just a soft scraping sound, quieter than the Germans' footsteps, quieter than their voices. He was digging a trench, not a proper foxhole. No time for that. Just a shallow depression. 18 inches deep, 6 feet long, 2 feet wide. Barely enough to hold a man, if that man was willing to lie completely flat and cover himself with dirt. The Germans were 30 yards out. Steele dug frantically. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from the physical effort of moving soil as fast as possible with a 7-inch aluminum spoon. Scoop, toss, scoop, toss. The rhythm became mechanical. He wasn't thinking anymore, just digging. Survival reduced to the simplest possible action: move dirt or die. At 20 yards, he heard a German soldier shout, They'd found something: boot prints. Steele's boot prints leading from the glider wreckage to his current position. He had maybe 90 seconds before they followed those prints directly to him. He dropped into the trench. It was barely deep enough. His body touched bottom, but his back was still exposed. He needed another 6 inches of depth. No time. The Germans were 15 yards out. He could hear their boots crushing grass. Steele reached up and pulled loose dirt over himself. He started with his legs, covering them completely, then his torso, then his arms. He pressed himself as flat as possible into the trench. The dirt was cold, damp, it smelled like earth and rain. He pulled more soil over his chest, his shoulders. He was burying himself alive. The final step was his head. He positioned the spoon over his face, creating a small air gap between his nose and mouth and the dirt that was about to cover him. Then he used his left hand to pull soil over his head, over his hair, over his forehead, over the spoon, over everything. Total silence, total silence. Just the sound of his own breathing echoing in the tiny space beneath the spoon. He lay completely still. The Germans were close now, maybe 10 yards. He could hear their voices clearly. German words he didn't understand. Urgent tones. They were excited. They'd found the glider. They were searching the wreckage. Footsteps passed within 3 feet of his position. Steele stopped breathing. The Germans were standing directly above him. He could hear their equipment rattling: rifle slings, ammunition pouches, boot leather creaking. One soldier was so close that Steele could hear him breathing. The soldier said something in German. Another voice responded. They were discussing something. The glider wreckage probably, or the boot prints. Steele's boot prints that led directly to the spot where he dug his trench, where he was now buried under 4 inches of Norman soil, with nothing but an aluminum spoon keeping dirt out of his airways. A flashlight beam swept across the ground above him. Steele saw light filtering through the thin layer of soil covering his face. The Germans were searching the area carefully, looking for anything out of place, any sign of disturbance. Fresh digging. Steele's lungs were burning. He needed to breathe. He'd been holding his breath for 40 seconds. His body was screaming for oxygen, but breathing meant the soil above his spoon might shift, might create visible movement, might give away his position. At 55 seconds, his vision started to tunnel. Gray edges closing in. Hypoxia. His body was shutting down from lack of oxygen. He had maybe 10 more seconds before he'd pass out, and if he passed out, he'd die, either from suffocation or from German bullets when they found his unconscious body. At 58 seconds, the flashlight moved away. The German voices faded slightly. They were moving toward the other side of the glider wreckage. Steele breathed, slow, controlled. The tiniest possible inhalation through the gap beneath the spoon. Air. Sweet, cold Norman air. His lungs expanded. The gray edges retreated. He breathed again. Quiet, invisible. The Germans searched the glider wreckage for 4 minutes. Steele heard them pulling at metal, moving canvas, checking the interior. They found the dead pilot. Someone said, "Tot" in German, dead. They found the co-pilot with the broken legs. Steele heard a short conversation, then a single gunshot, pistol, close range. They'd executed the wounded man. Standard Wehrmacht procedure for wounded enemy soldiers behind the lines. No facilities to hold prisoners. No medical care to spare. Quick death was considered more humane than slow death from untreated injuries. The Geneva Convention said differently. The Germans in Normandy weren't following the Geneva Convention. Steele lay motionless in his shallow grave and listened to them kill his co-pilot. The man's name was Sergeant Robert Hayes, 26 years old, Cleveland. Wife and 2 daughters. He'd shown Steele pictures during the flight from England. 2 girls, ages 4 and 6, blonde hair, matching dresses. The Germans moved away from the glider. Their voices faded. They were expanding their search pattern, looking for other survivors. Steele waited. He counted seconds in his head. When he reached 300, he decided it was safe to move. He pushed the dirt off his face slowly, used his hands to clear the soil away from the spoon, lifted his head 2 inches, looked around. The Germans were 60 yards away, moving toward the next hedgerow. Their flashlights were visible in the darkness. 12 soldiers, all focused on the adjacent field. Steele stood up, dirt cascaded off his uniform. He brushed soil from his face. His hair, he was shaking, not from cold, from adrenaline. From the knowledge that 12 German soldiers had walked within 3 feet of his buried body and never known he was there. He retrieved his spoon, wiped it on his pants, put it back in his boot. He'd need it again. Normandy was full of Germans. This wouldn't be his last close call. Steele moved away from the glider wreckage. He walked southwest, toward where he thought American lines might be. The 101st Airborne had dropped near Sainte-Mère-Église. That was maybe 2 miles southwest. If he could reach friendly forces, he could regroup, find a weapon, get back into the fight. He walked for 20 minutes through hedgerow country. The Norman bocage was a maze, ancient field boundaries marked by earthen walls topped with thick hedges. Every field was a natural fortress. Every hedgerow was a potential ambush site. The terrain favored defenders, German defenders. At 2:43 a.m., Steele encountered another German patrol, 4 soldiers. They were moving along a sunken lane, heading east. Steele saw them before they saw him. He dropped behind a hedgerow and pressed himself against the earthen bank. The patrol passed within 15 yards. Steele didn't move, didn't breathe. The Germans walked past. They weren't searching. They were marching. Probably reinforcements heading toward the beach, toward the sound of naval gunfire that had been rolling across the countryside since midnight. When the patrol disappeared, Steele continued southwest. At 3:12 a.m., he reached a small farmhouse. Dark, silent, no lights, no movement. He approached carefully. Checked the windows, empty. The family had evacuated or been evacuated. Probably days ago when the Germans had cleared civilians from the coastal areas. Steele entered through the back door. The interior was intact, furniture still in place, kitchen table, chairs, a crucifix on the wall, someone's home. Someone who'd been forced to leave everything behind when the war came to their doorstep. He searched the house quickly, looking for weapons, food, anything useful. He found a pantry with preserved vegetables, a loaf of bread, hard but edible, a canteen of water. He ate and drank, his first meal since leaving England 6 hours earlier. In the bedroom, he found civilian clothes, a farmer's work shirt, brown trousers, a cap. He considered changing. Civilian clothes would make him harder to identify from a distance. But wearing civilian clothes in combat violated the laws of war. If the Germans caught him in civilian clothing, they could execute him as a spy. He kept his uniform, dirty, torn, covered in Norman soil, but still recognizably American. That mattered. At 3:47 a.m., Steele left the farmhouse and continued southwest. The sky was beginning to lighten false dawn. Actual sunrise was still 90 minutes away, but visibility was improving. That made movement more dangerous, but it also made navigation easier. He could see landmarks, church steeples, tree lines, the direction of the coast. At 4:15 a.m., he encountered American soldiers, 2 paratroopers from the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment. They were crouched behind a hedgerow, watching a German roadblock 200 yards away. Steele approached from their flank, announced himself quietly, "American coming in." The paratroopers spun around, weapons raised. Steele froze, hands up. 101st Airborne, glider infantry. One paratrooper relaxed. "Prove it." Steele recited his service number, his unit designation, the name of his battalion commander, the password for D-Day operations, Flash. The paratrooper replied. He lowered his weapon. "You are a long way from your drop zone." Steele explained about the glider crash, the German search, the shallow grave, the spoon. The paratroopers listened without interrupting. When he finished, one of them handed him an M1 carbine. "You are gonna need this," the other paratrooper asked. "You still got that spoon?" Steele pulled it from his boot, showed them. The aluminum was bent, dirt still caked in the bowl. The paratroopers looked at it for a long moment. "Keep that," one of them said. "That is your lucky spoon now." Steele put it back in his boot. The 3 soldiers moved together toward American lines. They reached friendly positions at 5:23 a.m. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment had established a defensive perimeter near a small village called Angoville. Au Plain, Steele reported to the battalion command post. A captain interviewed him, asked about the glider crash, the German search, how he'd escaped. Steele told the story. The captain listened, took notes. When Steele mentioned the spoon, the captain stopped writing. "You dug yourself a grave with a mess kit spoon." "Yes, sir." "How deep?" 18 inches, maybe 20. The captain calculated in his head. "That is what? 500 scoops? 600? "I didn't count, sir." "How long did it take?" "Maybe 3 minutes." The captain wrote that down. "That is 200 scoops per minute." He looked up at Steele. "You dug 3 scoops per second for 3 minutes while 12 Germans were closing in on your position?" "Yes, sir." The captain closed his notebook. "That is the most desperate thing I've heard all day, and I've been listening to desperate stories since midnight." Steele was assigned to a scratch unit, glider infantry, paratroopers, anyone who'd made it to the assembly area. They needed every rifleman they could get. The Germans were counterattacking. The 506th was holding, but they needed reinforcements. Over the next 72 hours, Steele fought in 3 separate engagements around Angoville. Au Plain, he carried the M1 carbine the paratrooper had given him. He kept the spoon in his boot. He didn't use it again, didn't need to, but he kept it anyway. On the 9th of June, the scratch unit was withdrawn to the rear. They'd held their positions for 3 days against repeated German attacks. Casualties had been severe. Out of 40 men in Steele's platoon, 17 were dead or wounded. Steele was uninjured. Lucky, the other soldiers said. That spoon was keeping him alive. Steele didn't believe in luck. He believed in desperation, innovation, and the willingness to try impossible things when there were no other options. The spoon hadn't saved him, he'd saved himself. The spoon was just a tool, but he kept it anyway. The 101st Airborne Division remained in Normandy for 33 days. They fought through hedgerow country, taking villages one at a time. Carentan, Dead Man's Corner, every engagement was close range, brutal, exhausting. The Germans defended every hedgerow, every farmhouse, every road junction. Steele participated in the 14th of September Tate combat actions during the Normandy campaign. He was wounded once, minor shrapnel wound to his left shoulder on the 19th of June during an artillery barrage. The aid station patched him up and sent him back to his unit. He returned to action the same day. On the 10th of July, the 101st was pulled back to Utah Beach for evacuation to England. The Normandy campaign was winding down. American forces had broken out of the bocage. The front was moving east toward Paris. The paratroopers and glider infantry needed rest, resupply, training for the next operation. Steele boarded an LST at Utah Beach with what remained of his unit. 34 men out of the original 120, who'd flown from England on the 6th of June. The rest were casualties, dead, wounded, missing. The price of taking Normandy. During the voyage back to England, one of the paratroopers asked Steele about the spoon. Did he still have it? Steele showed him. The aluminum was more bent now. The bowl was nearly flat combat damage. The paratrooper asked if he could hold it. Steele handed it over. The paratrooper examined it carefully, turned it over in his hands. "This thing saved your life." "I saved my life," Steele replied. "The spoon was just what I had available." "Still," the paratrooper said, "most guys wouldn't have thought of it. Digging a grave with a spoon while Germans are hunting you? That is genius or crazy?" "Probably both," Steele admitted.